begin with some unscripted remarks. That's usually when I say something really idiotic. Anne, who I just met in advance, just before this began, was mentioning Allenby going into Jerusalem. And I realized that maybe I write these books to expiate the sins of my forefathers. My paternal grandfather, see, I told you I'd say something idiotic. My paternal grandfather was with Allenby. I wrote a book about Korea. My maternal grandfather was in the Korean War, and not on the Korean side either, or not in the North Korean side, or the Chinese side. Before I begin, I wanted to thank the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War for organizing this event. They always do a great job, and it's with much gratitude that I accepted the invitation to come here. So, let me begin. I should mention, I'm going to say a few things near the beginning of this talk which you might wonder have no connection at all to Israel. You might be scratching your head and wondering what I'm talking about. But I assure you that there is a connection with Israel, and it'll become apparent as I go along. So, the writer Michael Parente. Oh, you mentioned the Gowan's thesis. You'd probably be more apt to call it the Parente thesis. Many of you might know Michael Parente or know of him. He's talked about doing what he considers incisive analyses of various social and political processes, only to be dismissed as, oh, that's just a Marxist view. You know, go away. So after hearing this a few times, he asked, who is this Marx who keeps stealing all of my ideas? Charles Austin Beard. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Charles Austin Beard. You probably haven't heard of him, but in the first half of the 20th century, he was the most widely known historian in the United States. For the academics, if there are any academics here, he at one time was both the head of the American Historical Association and the American Political Science Association. He was known for various works, and one of his most famous is called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. He's known more generally for a view that stressed the economic interests of people in positions of influence. So Beard developed a point of view which shared much in common with Marx, but he wasn't a Marxist. And he insisted he wasn't a Marxist, and he didn't like to be called a Marxist. But like Parente, his analyses were often dismissed as, oh, it's just another Marxist view. Well, Beard argued that he derived his ideas independently of Marx. And he may have done so, insofar as it's possible to arrive at ideas independent of Marx when Marxist thinking was part of the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. I mean, even what we call Marxist thinking today often predated Marx, who himself absorbed ideas that were part of the zeitgeist, and then he elaborated on them and put a twist on them. Well, those ideas are part of a tradition which stands in opposition to another, the conservative tradition. But the tradition from which Marxism sprang, and from which some of Charles Austin Beard's ideas originate, and which structure Michael Parente's analyses, is a tradition of what I call the movement for universal equality. A tradition that was inaugurated by the French Revolution and then radically advanced by the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's within that tradition that I've written this book. And I tell you that so you'll have no illusions about who I am and about the lens through which I see the world and through which the book was written. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution invested, so this might seem the point where I'm trying to recruit you into the Communist Party, and I assure you I'm not doing that. There's a connection with Israel, you'll see it. The Bolshevik Revolution invested the rhetoric of the French Revolution, you know, about the rights of man and liberty, equality, and fraternity, with substance, so that the concept of equality came to cover all people, regardless of how they were categorized or how they categorized themselves. So blacks as much as whites, women as much as men, Jews as much as Christians, and so on. So in other words, the Bolsheviks insisted that equality applied to more than white, Christian, male property owners. It applied to everyone equally, to the same degree. Now, a Marxist, an Italian Marxist, a famous one named Gramsci, argued that communism, so this movement inaugurated by the Bolshevik Revolution, is the expression of the universal, or the concept of universal equality, which he said was inherent in liberal democracy but wasn't actualized by it. It's what you get if you follow the French Revolution and liberal democracy to its logical conclusion. Frantz Fanon, who some of you may have heard of, whose most famous work was The Wretched of the Earth, echoed Gramsci. He believed, and I'm quoting him now, all the elements of a solution to the great problems of humanity have at different times existed in European thought, by which he was meant liberalism. The problem, he argued, was that Europeans had not carried out in practice the mission that fell to them. Instead, the liberal Democrats developed a philosophy of liberty, but applied it in practice to white, male property owners. And then they tolerated what are really anti-liberal institutions. They tolerated apartheid, they tolerated slavery, they tolerated colonialism, they tolerated patriarchy, and they tolerated anti-Semitism. So it was left to the Bolsheviks to invest the rhetoric of liberal democracy with substance, with meaning. So how did the political left tradition of equality affect the Jews? Well, the French Revolution emancipated the Jews in France. One of the principal figures of the revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, who's either reviled or celebrated, depending upon which part of this political spectrum you are, he insisted on the repeal of all discriminatory laws against the Jewish community. Here's what he said. How can you blame the Jews for the persecutions they have suffered in certain countries? These persecutions are national crimes that we must expiate by restoring to the Jews their imprescriptible rights, of which no human authority can deprive them. Let us give them back their happiness and their virtue by restoring their dignity as men and citizens, as equal citizens. While skipping ahead to the Russian Revolution, it overthrew the Tsarist monarchy, one of the vilest institutions of anti-Semitism in history. Now, because the anti-Semitic crimes of the Nazis culminated in a genocide, they overshadowed the anti-Semitic crimes of the Russian monarchy, which, while they did not result in a genocide, were nevertheless extreme. And so as a consequence, we kind of lose sight of just how abhorrent the Tsarist Empire was in its treatment of the Jews, along with its treatment of a whole lot of other people. The monarchy treated the Jews as deserving of persecution. They visited immense suffering on them, and they used them as scapegoats to recruit Russian peasants into a regime of lordly rule over the Jews and of other people. Much as the Nazis would later do, much as they would conscript the lower orders into their elitist movement of lordly rule over the Jews and the Slavs. Well, it was the Russian Revolution that overthrew the Tsarist monarchy. It was the Russian Revolution that emancipated the Jews in Russia. And it was the Russian Revolution that disrupted the vile institution of Tsarist anti-Semitism. So the point, then, is that the emancipation of the Jews and their treatment as fully equal and human was an inevitable policy of a movement to universalize equality and to emancipate all people from oppression. Not just the working class of Europe, which we might think if we're saying this is the Bolsheviks, but all oppressed categories of human beings. So in practice, maybe not always in theory, but in practice, communism has been a movement of universal emancipation. Which calls to mind an article I read in the summer in the New York Times. Appeared in the July 26th edition. And it was titled, Can communists be good Americans? And let me just read a bit from it. Kevin Baker's review of David Maraniss' A Good American Family, The Red Scare, and My Father ends with Baker trying to puzzle out why in the world any great American spirit would be drawn to joining the Communist Party. After more than 3 decades of serious treatment by acclaimed historians and nonfiction writers, this subject is hardly one of life's great mysteries. Aside from being at the cutting edge of civil rights through the first half of the 20th century, American communism offered people like Maraniss' father, working class children of Jewish immigrants, the priceless feeling that they had become more than the sum of their life's parts. But as historians of the United States social movements, we know that communism did much more than light a fire in people's imaginations, scratch the surface of any significant progressive movement in the United States over the last 100 years, and you'll find participants with ties to American communism. Instead of dreary Russian dogma, communism for most Americans involved was about committed and effective grassroots organizing. So as a consequence of this liberal character of communism, the movement had a magnetic appeal to Jews. The Jews were represented among communists far in excess of their numbers in the population. So let me read you just an excerpt from my book. Jews have been very strongly overrepresented among revolutionaries. Indeed, the history of radical socialism teems with secular Jewish figures. Not all of them communists, but all of them committed to universal equality. The list includes Kurt Eisner, the premier of the Bavarian Socialist Republic at the end of World War I, Gustav Landauer, Eisner's education minister, the Polish-German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg, who was the founder of the German Communist Party, Bela Kun, leader of the short-lived Soviet Republic in Hungary at the end of World War I, Matthias Rákosi, the leader of Communist Hungary after 1948, the American anarchist Emma Goldman, Noam Chomsky, and members of Lenin's inner circle, including Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Radek. Half the members of revolutionary parties in Russia prior to 1917 were Jews. Half the members. Between 1930 and the end of the Second World War, Jews made up almost half the members of the Communist Party of the United States. The majority of American whites who took part in the civil rights struggle of the early 1960s were Jewish. They made up 2/3 of the Freedom Riders in the US South in 1961, and between 1/2 and 2/3 of the volunteers in the Mississippi Summer of 1964. Even in the communist parties of Arab countries, of Egypt and Iraq, Jews were founders and leaders. Jews are still overrepresented in radical left-wing groups around the world. Well, in the first half of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, most Jews had abandoned Judaism. And they had a secular outlook. So they fit quite comfortably into these secular, atheist, communist parties. What's more, because they had been defined by the larger societies in which they lived as aliens, they were unlikely to have strong national attachments to the majority ethnic group within the countries in which they lived, so they accepted communist internationalism easily. They saw themselves less as citizens of ethnic states and more as citizens of the world. What's more, very importantly, they refused to limit their concerns to their own tribe. They had this grand dream of salvation that applied not just to Jews, but to all of humanity. A dream of salvation that would rescue all people from oppression. So, what about the conservative tradition? The political right, by contrast to the movement for universal equality, prefers either the status quo or often a return to some kind of presumed glorious past before people were agitating for equality and democracy. They favor hierarchy. They often promote religion and mythology and tradition over reason, and they embrace the conviction that human beings are inherently base and evil. and that the potential for human progress is therefore limited. You may know some of these people, the people who insist that humans are selfish, humans can never be changed, humans are just, anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool. This is a very pessimistic view of humanity. Humans are greedy, humans are hierarchical, humans are warlike, and anyone who thinks you can build a society of universal equality is seriously deluded. That's the conservative view. So where does Zionism fit in? And Zionism is a reference to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And Zion is used to stand for Jerusalem in the same way that the White House is used to stand for the US presidency or the executive. So Zionist refers to movements to foster the migration of Jews to Jerusalem or to Palestine. Zionism as an early movement was not a movement of the Jews. It was a movement of Christians who believed that facilitating the return of the Jews to Palestine would fulfill biblical prophecies about the return of Jesus. Christian Zionism exists today as a very conservative evangelical movement whose followers include U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, the Brazilian president. The Christian Zionists believe that supporting Israel is something that God demands of them. It's an obligation. And they're not necessarily fond of Jews. They're not necessarily opposed to anti-Semitism. It's just that they think Israel fulfills a biblical prophecy and that all Jews should migrate to Israel, and so that the Christian Savior will return to earth to take the righteous to heaven and will take the Jews to heaven as well if they agree to convert to Christianity. So that's Christian Zionism. But let me talk about political Zionism. Political Zionism is more directly related to the creation of Israel. It was a movement inaugurated by Jews, not by religious Jews, but by secular, non-religious Jews, some of whom were atheists. In the latter part of the 19th century, some secular Jews saw Zionism as a solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. So the idea was, let's leave Europe, we'll settle in Palestine in a Jewish majority state, which by virtue of the fact that the population would be Jewish in the majority would be free from anti-Semitism. So this was a solution that was very different from the one proposed by the communists of building a world of universal equality. So I told you there'd be a connection here between communism and Israel. So why did political Zionists reject the communist view of building a world of universal equality? Well, they rejected it because they didn't believe such a world could be built. They still don't believe that. They believe that anti-Semitism is permanent, it's inevitable, it's built into human nature, and human nature is fundamentally corrupt and incorrigible, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool or has fallen prey to some kind of romantic illusion. Political Zionism then is very much part of the conservative tradition. The father of political Zionism was Theodor Herzl, a non-religious 19th century Austrian Jew, playwright, novelist, journalist. He was clearly a conservative, and he welcomed, he embraced the status quo in every respect but one. He was opposed to Europe's anti-Semitism. But other than that, he was pretty comfortable with the way things were in Europe. He saw anti-Semitism not as a social institution that could be changed, but as a largely irremediable part of human nature that could never be overcome. In his view, and in the view of Zionists today, anti-Semitism will always be with us. It may become dormant, but there's always a danger that it will erupt. The only solution, therefore, to the presumed immutability of anti-Semitism, according to Herzl and his followers, is Jewish separation. So as a conservative, Herzl, I said, embraced the status quo. He embraced conservative tradition. He was in favor of aristocracy. He was a proponent of the view that people couldn't govern themselves, that this ought to be left to a family born to rule. He was also a social Darwinian who believed the triumph of the strong over the weak was not only inevitable but desirable. And like reactionaries before and after him, he embraced a return to a glorious past. Not only to a glorious past before people started agitating for democracy and equality and self-determination, but a return to the glorious past of the Jewish state of antiquity. So, Herzl sought the backing of colonial powers for his project of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And he recognized that the only way they were going to get any traction was to get some kind of imperialist power to back his project. So how is he going to do that? Well, he'd have to present the benefits to creating a Jewish state in Palestine. So he said that Zionism would offer a challenge posed by the movement of universal equality in Europe. Herzl promised that rather than pursuing revolution in Europe to bring about a world of universal equality, Jews, we said, were the agitators. It was the Jews who were pushing for socialism, the Jews that were behind every kind of disruption and challenge to the established order. Well, they would leave Europe and they would settle in the land of the Arabs. And so all these growing demands for political equality and for social equality and for economic equality, all of which he said were championed by the Jews, and that is part of the conservative tradition. It's Jews who are responsible for all of the challenges to the established order. Well, this would all be sublimated into a movement to colonize Palestine, where Jews would find the economic opportunities that weren't available to them in Europe. So rather than life in Europe, poverty and chronic unemployment and persecution, they would become farmers on their own land in Palestine, achieving economic security and freeing themselves from anti-Semitism. So this would work out well for the Jews of Europe. This would be good also for the rulers of Europe, who would no longer have to worry about contending with these growing demands for equality, championed by the Jewish agitators. It would not, we know, be good for the Arabs, but Herzl thought it would, or at least he argued that it would. He said the Arabs would welcome the Jews because, and they would show gratitude, because they would bring civilization to the Arabs. He wrote a novel called Old New Land, in which he imagined the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, which was sponsored by Turkey, which at the time Palestine was under the domination of the Ottoman Empire. And he portrayed the Arabs as essentially backward people who couldn't care for themselves. So they would welcome the Jews because the Jews would come along and bring civilization, and they would show gratitude. Herzl, and this is important to the argument that's going to be made in my book, Herzl also promised that the rulers of imperial Europe, that a Jewish state under their sponsorship would protect their interests in the Middle East. It would be an outpost of civilization. The Jewish state would become the guardian of the interests of any empire that would sponsor it. So the initial sponsor of the movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine was Britain, mainly because it was seeking Jewish support in its war with Germany. Now here's the historian Arnold J. Toynbee.
Your microphone is drifting, sorry.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry. So the motive, this is Toynbee speaking, or writing, the motive for British support of the Jewish homeland in Palestine was to compete with Germany for support of the world Jewish community. This is during the First World War. Britain was allied with Russia, the Tsarist monarchy a vile institution of anti-Semitism. So the British were looking for support from the world Jewish community, particularly the American, German, and Austrian branch, or Jewish communities. At the time, Russia was enemy number one for the Jews, for obvious reasons. When the Germans drove the Russians back in 1915, as they retreated, what did the Russians do? They slaughtered the Jews as they went. The Germans then brought a party of about 30 American Jewish journalists and showed them all that the Russians had done. Now this gave a fright to the British government, and they felt they must do something to counteract it. And they thought, well, if we conquer Palestine, this is a trump card, because we can offer Palestine to the Jews and counteract the damage that has been done to the reputation of the Allies by the Tsarist monarchy. France and Britain so became sponsors of the State of Israel in the 1950s, mainly because they valued Israel as a tool for crushing Arab nationalism, the Arab nationalism of Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been British and French owned, and was backing movements of Arabs to free themselves from the grips of British and French colonialism. Well, since 1967, the United States, the greatest imperialist power in history, has used Israel in exactly the manner Herzl intended, as a battering ram to knock down all resistance to the domination of the Middle East by the West. Now, I have a commitment to a theory of foreign policy. Oh, maybe this is, you talked, the Cowan's thesis, or the Parenti thesis, really. And my commitment is that the foreign policy decisions of states ultimately reflect the way in which their economies are organized. And in the case of the United States, that means that Washington's foreign policy is traceable to imperatives in its capitalist economy to incessantly expand its economic and political and ideological frontiers. Or as I put it in my book, dominating the Middle East has always been an outcome of a compulsion that has chased US investors over the entire surface of the globe, to nestle everywhere, to settle everywhere, to establish connections everywhere. And that is the compulsion of profit making. So the continual drive of capitalism to conquer new markets and secure new investment opportunities creates two sets of conflicts. First, there's a conflict between competing states for the same profit-making opportunities. And second, there's a conflict arising in the resistance of people who live on the territory whose frontiers are being violated by the expanding states in search of markets and investment opportunities for their dominant class. Kind of to illustrate this, let me give you an idea of what Woodrow Wilson once said. Woodrow Wilson was the US president immediately before and during World War I. This is what he said. He was also an academic. He was giving a lecture at Columbia University. Here's what he said. Since trade ignores national boundaries and manufacturers insist on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him. And the doors of the nations which are closed must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. No useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. So US foreign policy has long followed this Wilsonian point of view. US investors and business people cannot be denied any of the profit-making opportunities that arise anywhere in the world. That is the function of the US state, to ensure that those people have access to every profit-making opportunity that is available, and on terms that are at least as good as those available in the United States. So apropos of this, You might want to know that the US State Department complained about the failure of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to dismantle what it called his Soviet economic model, which limited US profit-making opportunities in Syria. And they complained about his refusal to reform his economy to fully open it to US exports and investments. You might also want to know that Washington considers Iran's economy to be insufficiently accommodating of US trade and investment. This was also true of Libya's economy and Arab nationalist Iraq's economy, and remains true of North Korea's and Venezuela's and China's and Cuba's.
You forgot to mention the big one, Russia.
Yeah. So if the sovereignty of unwilling nations is outraged in the process of battering down their doors, it's predictable that a resistance will very likely arise. Well, so Israel, as I pointed out, was envisaged by the political Zionists as an instrument that would be used by a patron empire to quell the resistance of the people in the Middle East to outrages against their sovereignty. So this was the essential quid pro quo that Herzl had offered in empire. In return for sponsorship of a large power, a Jewish state in Palestine as an extension of the West would suppress the resistance of the natives to the expansion of the economic frontiers of the Jewish state's imperialist sponsor. So essentially, the Zionist Jews were renting themselves out as muscle for whatever empire would back their solution to anti-Semitism. So Herzl said the Jewish state would be a link in Europe's rampart against Asia and an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Moshe Dayan, who held several key posts in the Israeli government, is reputed to have said that the Jewish people has a mission, especially in its Israeli branch. In this part of the world, it has to be a rock, an extension of the West against which the waves of Arab nationalism will be broken. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's current prime minister, has in this tradition acknowledged that Israel is, quote, the West's outpost in the Middle East. Now you may have noticed that Western news media often refer to Israel as a Western nation, even though it's located in the East. Well, that's an implicit recognition of Israel as a Western outpost in the East. Leaders of the resistance to the expansion of Western economic, political, and ideological frontiers in the Middle East have seen the role of Israel in exactly the same light. Saddam Hussein, the Arab nationalist leader of Iraq, called Israel a club the United States uses against the Arabs. Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose name at one time was synonymous with Arab nationalism. If you're an Arab nationalist, you called yourself a Nasserist. He described Israel as a poisoned dagger implanted by the West in the heart of the Arab nation. Leila Hadid, the Palestinian revolutionary, called Israel America and Europe combined in Palestine. Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Lebanese resistance organization Hezbollah, says that the United States wants the Middle East to be under its political, military, security, economic, and cultural domination, and that Washington uses Israel as the tool to promote this agenda. This, however, is not the view of people who vaguely represent themselves as being on the political left, or sometimes are understood incorrectly to be on the political left, and in fact are conservatives and hold conservative views, or views at least in the conservative tradition. Jews, as I mentioned before, have always been presented in the conservative tradition as carriers of, quote, the impossible ideal of equality. That's how Churchill described it, the impossible idea of equality. Or what Hitler called the Judeo-Bolshevik virus, and by which he meant the virus of universal equality. Judeo-Bolshevik. He saw Jews and Bolsheviks as the same. So much as Hitler is presented as unique in a category of his own, his views on Jews fit comfortably in this long-standing anti-Jewish conservative tradition which sees world events manipulated by Jews lurking in the shadows, trying to bring about a world of, quote, impossible equality. They're challenging the established condition, or the established order. They're challenging, they're going to overthrow Christian civilization. So for example, Edmund Burke and other conservative thinkers attributed the French Revolution to a Jewish conspiracy. The Jews benefited from the French Revolution because they're emancipated. Therefore, according to this line of reasoning, they benefited, therefore they must have been the instigators. You know, the old cui bono reasoning. Who benefited? Well, whoever benefited must have been the culprit, I mean the person who did it. The Bolshevik Revolution was also attributed to a Jewish conspiracy, not only by Hitler, but by Winston Churchill, by the British cabinet, by US politicians, by French statesmen, by Henry Ford, and today, by someone you may have heard of, named Paul Craig Roberts. And again, the reasoning was thus. Many of the Bolsheviks were Jews. The revolution promoted universal equality. The Jews benefited from the revolution. Therefore, the revolution is a conspiracy of the Jews to destroy Christian civilization and establish a world of impossible equality. The British novelist John Buchan, I don't know if any of you have ever read him.
Canadian. Well, he was our GG.
British Canadian?
I tried to read him once, it was quite boring. But he headed the propaganda agency for Britain in World War I. He wrote a novel called The 39 Steps. It was later made into a film. And 39 Steps reinforced the dominant British government view at the time that Jews lurked in the shadows, manipulating world events. So let me read you something that he said. In some respect, not in some respects, in every respect, this is kind of offensive. Not kind of offensive, it is offensive. He wrote, "Away behind all the governments and the armies, there was a big subterranean movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. The Jew was behind it." Why does he say the Jew? You never hear anyone say the Muslim, the Christian, the atheist. The Jew was behind it, and the Jew hated Russia worse than hell. Well, there's a good reason for that. This is a return match for the pogroms. The Jew is everywhere, with an eye like a rattlesnake. He's the man who's ruling the world just now. Mark Sykes, you might know Mark Sykes, the British diplomat whose name lives in infamy in the Arab world, and should live in infamy everywhere. The co-author, along with his French counterpart, François-Georges-Picot, of the secret pact, along with the Russians, to carve up Arab West Asia.
What's it called, the Sykes-Picot Pact?
Yes, a pact, by the way, that was revealed by the Bolsheviks. He never abandoned his childhood belief in this shadowy cabal of Jews who moved in mysterious ways to control world affairs. So sadly, these views, as ridiculous as they are centerpieces of the conservative tradition, and they're still with us. And they're still with us in the writing of people who attribute US foreign policy in the Middle East to the Jews. The political scientists John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walsh wrote an article in 2006 titled The Israel Lobby, and then they had a book the following year which made the case that US Middle East policy has been hijacked by the Jews and their lobby acting on behalf of Israel. And it's probably because they're liberals that they came up with this view. But anyway, I'll elaborate on that a bit more. Two people who aren't liberals, but would be considered more radical leftists, John Brickmont and Diana Johnston, well respected in left circles, followed this by citing favorably people who told them that, quote, "As far as the drive to war with Syria is concerned, it is Israel that directs US policy." Apparently they hadn't noticed that the United States' drive to war against Arab nationalism, not only the Egyptian kind, but the Syrian kind and the Iraqi kind, predates the so-called special relationship that Washington has with Israel. It's been going on for some time. Back to Paul Craig Roberts. As far as I can tell, he is a barely disguised fascist, and I don't use the F word loosely. His views on Israel, on Jews, are views that people who followed Hitler and Hitler himself would salute. Washington, Roberts argues, acts as an agent of Netanyahu. Netanyahu's manipulating US foreign policy. John Bolton, says Roberts, as an Israeli agent. Hitler, he says, was a man of the people, a man of the German people, and whose good works were disrupted by a war engineered by Churchill, who was financed by who?
Jews.
Yes, by the Jewish money.
Did I get a cookie for that?
So, you know, like Mark Sykes and Hitler and Burke and Churchill, Roberts, who actually had a career as a conservative newspaper columnist, now seems to have been embraced by parts of the left for inexplicable reasons, sees Jews in everything. So whereas a communist might talk of John Bolton as an agent of corporate America, Roberts dubs him an agent of the Jews. He's not a Jew, so you have to call him an agent of the Jews. Roberts also attributes the Holocaust not to Hitler, not to Nazis, but to Russian peasants who he says were taking revenge on their Jewish neighbors for their ill treatment at the hands of, and I'm using Roberts' words here, at the hands of Judeo-Bolsheviks. It's following a trail well trod by Hitler. So Roberts argues that Bolshevism was a conspiracy of the Jews. So on so-called left-wing websites, we have analysis that would fit quite comfortably in Mein Kampf. So there are now innumerable books written by Americans and others whose explanation of US support for Israel is that Washington has been hijacked by the Jews and its agents, like John Bolton, not that Israel is an instrument of the United States which helps Washington accomplish what the United States has been doing from the very moment of its birth, namely projecting its economic frontiers outward. Now, that's not the established view, but think about it. The United States began as 13 colonies on the east coast of North America, and through conquest soon grew to cover a continental expanse. Then added colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, which it maintains, now calls them territories, they're colonies. In the earlier part of the 20th century, they're quite open and called them colonies, Guam, at the time Philippines, and other places, Guantanamo Bay. And since the Second World War, you know, the United States has established an informal empire which spans much of the globe, with a few exceptions. Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, those aren't part of the US empire. So it's no accident that the countries that are not part of the US empire happen to be targets of US hostility. So always US expansion was driven by a quest for new land, for new markets, for new investment opportunities. And incessant expansion met resistance from other expanding powers, from Germany, from Japan, and from local forces of independence and national assertiveness in the territories into which the United States was driven by its economy to project power. Israel has provided or proved to be helpful to this project in a number of ways. And much of my book is a chronicle of the various ways in which Israel has assisted the United States in advancing the economic interests of the United States' wealthiest citizens, mainly by crushing or intimidating the local forces of independence that opposed the expansion of US economic frontiers and cultural and ideological frontiers and onto their territories. So the targets have also included the Arabs, inspired by the Arab nationalism of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Arabs inspired by the Arab nationalism of the Arab Ba'ath socialist parties of the Syrians and the Iraqis, and also the resistance project of the Iranian Revolution. Israel has been an effective instrument of US imperialism because its interests overlap those of the United States. Both are opposed to local forces of independence and national assertiveness in the Middle East. Israel, because it's a settler state surrounded by natives who are understandably hostile because their territory has either been usurped or threatened by Israel. In the United States, because its investors covet the natural resources and economic opportunities of the natives' territories. So Israel hates independence movements because they're against Israel's settler colonialism, and the US government hates independence movements because they're against the extension of US economic supremacy into their territory. So the two countries then have an identity of interest or overlapping interests. And this overlapping of interest accounts for their overlapping policy. It's not Jews lurking in the background, pulling the strings in Washington. So let me just end with this. So in his book, A World Without Islam, which by the way isn't a world, the title isn't a wish for a world without Islam. The title is, let's do a thought experiment where we imagine a world without Islam and see what the world would look like. This was written by a guy who was in the CIA. He was the former CIA station chief in Kabul, Graham E. Fuller, who now teaches university in BC. So he argued that the 9/11 and other attacks on the United States by militant Muslims would have occurred even in a world without Islam, because the attacks were a reaction against US imperialism and were not the product of the attacker's religion. He said, it would be a mistake to consider Islam as the source of resistance. Otherwise, we'd have to believe that if these Muslims were not Muslims, they would not be rebelling against foreign domination. Who doesn't rebel against foreign domination? You don't have to look to religion to explain why they were resisting. Fuller also served as the vice chair of the US National Intelligence Council, and he acknowledged that US domination of the Middle East is attributable above all to, quote, the Muslim world's oil and energy resources. US Middle East policy is shaped, he said, by concerns about ownership of oil, control of oil companies, pricing policies, shares of prices, and political manipulation of leaders in order to obtain the best deals on oil. So let's conduct a similar exercise. Let's do a similar thought experiment and imagine a world without Israel. Would US foreign policy be any different? Would the United States' concerns about the ownership of oil companies, pricing policies and shares of prices, political manipulation of leaders in order to obtain the best deals on oil, would they no longer exist? I mean, of course they would exist. So the theory that the Jews and the Israeli lobby control US foreign policy reflects a failure to understand the reality of the United States. It's an imperialist power. It has always been an imperialist power, and the way it behaves in the Middle East is no different from the way it behaves in Latin America. It's no different from the way it behaves in Africa. It's no different from the way it behaves in East Asia.
In China back in the day?
So, I said I was going to end, but I'll end with one last person. I said, I was talking about Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. So he's a man who's actually 1 year younger than me. He's lived with the dangers posed by Israel to the Arab world all his life. So he has more than a passing acquaintance with the role played by Israel in the US empire. Nasrallah argues, as I mentioned previously, that the United States wants the Middle East to be under its political, military, security, economic, and cultural domination. Washington uses Israel, he says, as a tool to promote this agenda. Israel depends for its existence, he argues, on the United States. If the financial, economic, and military support that Washington grants Tel Aviv stops, Israel ceases to exist. The victims of Israel, argues Nasrallah, are the Palestinians and Lebanese. I would argue that the victims are beyond the Palestinian and Lebanese and include the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Iranians. But he limits this to the Palestinians and Lebanese. He said both who have suffered occupation and massacre at Israel's hands. Blame for Israeli actions then lies, he argues, more with Washington, Israel's master, than with Netanyahu and his terrorist army. Therefore, Palestinians and Lebanese are the primary victims of the US domination of the Middle East. US foreign policy, he goes on to argue, is aimed at plundering the region's oil, its gas, and its riches. It's driven by the owners of oil and weapons companies, not by human rights organizations. Indeed, all of Washington's talk, he says, about human rights and democracy is meaningless since the biggest dictatorships in the region are sponsored by the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Well, there's a long list. I won't go through it. He continues that US allies in the region are nothing but local administrations headed by a king or a president or a prime minister. In Netanyahu's case, answerable to Washington. So the decisions of war, peace, foreign policy, and markets are in the hands of their master, the United States. Those are his words. This is as true for the Israelis as it is for the Saudis, as it is for the Emiratis, as it is for the Qataris, as it is for the Kuwaitis, as it is for the Egyptians, as it is for the Jordanians. And so maybe I just might end on this. We talk about, some people argue that the United States has a special relationship with Israel, that reflects Israeli control over US foreign policy. The United States also has a special relationship with Saudi Arabia. So why doesn't anyone talk about the Saudis controlling US foreign policy? And you could probably make a more compelling case that they control US foreign policy than you could Israel. But anyway, so I will end there. Thank you very much.